Hello and welcome to The World Deciphered, a weekly talk show on national and global security issues brought to you by the Cipher Brief. I'm your host this week, Suzanne Kelly. U.S. President Joe Biden is finally allowing Ukraine to use the long-range weapons known as ATACMS that the U.S. has provided to hit military targets inside of Russia. But with just under 2 months before Donald Trump is inaugurated, will the lifting of these restrictions and other efforts actually make a difference on the battlefield? We're talking with Doug Lute, former U.S. ambassador to NATO, about what he thinks can still be done.
Let me just unpack why I think removing these restrictions could change the momentum over time, provided that we give a sufficient number of ATACMS.
And Cipher Brief Chief International Correspondent Meurmishvili sits down with Archbishop Borys Gudziak of the Ukrainian Catholic Church to talk about what he describes as an unbearable situation in the country. From the constant barrage of attacks against civilian infrastructure, to collaborators working inside of churches, to efforts to secure the return of prisoners of war and the tens of thousands of Ukrainian children that have been kidnapped since this war began.
It has not been a highly successful process. Some POWs have been returned, but tens and tens of thousands of children have not.
Before we get to it, let's check in with Cipher Brief Managing Editor Tom Nagorski in New York for a look at what's making headlines at thecipherbrief.com this week. Tom?
Hey, Suzanne. Well, we begin with major developments in the war in Ukraine. In just 1 week, the White House dropped restrictions on Ukraine's use of American missiles against Russia, dropped its opposition to giving Ukraine anti-personnel landmines, and U.S. officials said they want to get every penny of U.S. aid to Ukraine before the Trump team takes over. The Biden administration had resisted many of these Ukrainian requests for a long time. Now it looks like they're in a kind of race against time, trying to improve Ukraine's negotiating position before Trump takes office and tries to end the war. Normally, a lame duck president can't do very much. These 2 months in Ukraine may prove a big exception to that rule. Then there's the Russian response. Vladimir Putin formally altered Russia's official nuclear doctrine. This may be symbolic, but what it now says is, quote, nuclear deterrence is aimed to ensure that any potential adversary realizes the inevitability of retribution in case of an aggression against Russia. It's widely seen as the latest nuclear threat from the Kremlin against the West for helping Ukraine. And lastly, from that side of the world, on Thursday, another message from the Kremlin. Russia fired a ballistic missile at Ukraine. It's a weapon capable of carrying a nuclear payload. Obviously, this one wasn't. But it's as dynamic a week, Suzanne, in Ukraine as we've seen in a long time. In the Middle East, the big story there is the International Criminal Court's indictment of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his former defense minister on charges of crimes against humanity in Gaza. Many analysts are saying this may actually strengthen Netanyahu on the home front, where the indictment was widely criticized. What's not clear at all is whether they'll have any impact on Israel's conduct of the war. And for all the attention we pay to threats against critical infrastructure in this country, we've been watching threats to what may be the most critical piece of infrastructure anywhere on Earth. We're talking about undersea cables, which run for hundreds of thousands of miles below the sea and are essential for everything from internet use, military communications, financial data, and much more. 2 separate cables in the Baltic Sea were cut last week. Damage to undersea cables is usually accidental, but in these cases, officials believe sabotage was involved, and those suspicions have fallen on Russia and China. A full report is up on our site. Suffice to say, Suzanne, it's just one more thing to worry about in the world of global security. Back to you.
Thanks very much, Tom. Also at thecipherbrief.com this week, inside Iran's alleged assassination efforts against President-elect Donald Trump. Elaine Shannon reports that despite recent news that Tehran assured Washington they were not pursuing assassination efforts against the former and soon-to-be president, sources say that Tehran hasn't abandoned the effort. You can read more at thecipherbrief.com. There is less than 2 months to go now before Donald Trump is inaugurated for the second time as President of the United States. The president-elect was very clear on the campaign trail that he intended to end the war in Ukraine, but he didn't say how. And now the Biden administration is taking what arguably is the most aggressive approach that it has since the war started 2.5 years ago by allowing the use of long-range weapons to be used against military targets inside of Russia. But is it too little, too late? That's the question we posed to Doug Lute, former U.S. ambassador to NATO. Can these last-ditch efforts really make an impact on the outcome of this war?
Well, first of all, I mean, the question actually starts with a tone of regret, right? Which is, why didn't we do this nearly 3 years ago? I mean, why have we so placed ourselves under the constraints of what you might call incrementalism with regard to our support to Ukraine, which has really been, I think, in terms of the Western assistance program, it's been the main thing. It's been the dominant theme. It's true that we've provided an enormous amount of security assistance to Ukraine alongside our European allies, who, by the way, actually have surpassed us in terms of the dollar amount or the euro amount of what they've provided, right? But together we've provided an enormous amount to Ukraine. But it's also true that we've done so in a very bureaucratic, incremental, step-by-step approach, which I think has actually been a major contributor to the battlefield situation today, which can be summed up as rough stalemate, or maybe alternatively slowly eroding stalemate in favor of Russia, largely because attrition warfare plays to the hand of the stronger, larger partner, or the larger protagonist, and of course in this case that's Russia. So I think we bear some responsibility, and this incremental approach bears some responsibility for where we are in the battlefield. So when you see decisions like this most recent lifting of the geographic restrictions on especially the American ATACMS, which is think sort of 200-mile ballistic missile, surface-to-surface ballistic missile system that have been in the hands of the Ukrainians for some months now. But only recently has the Biden administration taken the decision to remove the restrictions on the Ukrainians to actually use this missile system where it could be perhaps most effective, which is on the vulnerable military targets inside Russia itself. So Ukraine has used ATACMS over the last months on Ukrainian occupied territory, so Ukrainian sovereign territory, and has, with pretty good effect, pretty significant effect, had impact especially on the Crimea Peninsula because of the extended range of the system. But now they can use it, and apparently there are first reports this week that they have used it on Russian territory itself. So the question is it too little, too late? It's very difficult to imagine that the Ukrainians have a sufficient number of ATACMS to actually make a significant battlefield difference in the next 2 months. So we're at almost precisely, as we record this today, almost precisely 2 months before Inauguration Day. So it's difficult to imagine that they have a sufficient on-hand stockpile of ATACMS to actually change the battlefield momentum. But I nonetheless applaud the Biden administration decision to remove this restriction and let the Ukrainians target the Russian vulnerabilities that I think are very meaningful from an operational perspective. And I know this is kind of a long response to your question, but let me just unpack why I think removing these restrictions could change the momentum over time, provided that we give a sufficient number of ATACMS to Ukrainians. And I think there are largely two factors that I'd say. First of all is the relative low quality of the occupying Russian force in Ukraine. So there's some 500,000 Russian soldiers on sovereign Ukrainian territory. But when you look behind that number, behind the quantitative factor, the quality indicators of those Russian occupying troops is very low. This is a low quality, low grade army. So low morale, poorly equipped, poorly trained, poorly led, sometimes pressed into combat at the sort of bayonet point, and operating largely under a coercive leadership regime, right? So that's the nature of the occupying army. The second factor I'd cite is that low-grade army depends on logistics from inside Russia. And by Russian military convention and doctrine, Russian ground logistics are railroad based. So they don't have, as the US Army has, sort of an air, ground, sea, multiple chains of logistics options. They have rail. And this has been a historical factor because of the great distances inside Russia itself, right? And the fact that the Russian army conventionally relies on mass, which means it needs masses of munitions, it needs masses of manpower, and so forth, right? So those factors have caused the Russians to rely on rail for resupply. And rail resupply is vulnerable resupply because railroads are fixed, right? So you have switching yards, engine yards, diesel fuel depots that fuel the engines, bridges, tunnels, and so forth, right? All of which could be struck if you had sufficient number of long-range strike systems to do so. And if you could significantly impede Russian logistics, then combined with the low-grade occupying army, you might have an equation for internal dissension and potentially even collapse of the Russian occupying force. But again, you'd have to do this over time. It would be a question of attack and reattack. You'd have to have patience, and you'd have to have sufficient quantity of systems like ATACMS in order to do this. But I think there's a vulnerability here. And the attractive thing, as an old military guy, the attractive thing here would be that this would present the Ukrainians an option to attack a Russian weakness rather than a Russian strength. You know, the summer of 23 featured the Ukrainians banging their heads up against the well-dug-in, in-depth Russian defensive positions in frontal assaults. That's attacking the Russian strength. And of course, long-standing military convention is you avoid an opponent's strength and attack his weakness. So this would present the Ukrainians an option for attacking what I think is a Russian weakness.
Yeah. It'll be interesting to see what they're able to do with that equipment in the time frame that they have up to
Right.
the inauguration day, which everyone is looking at that day as sort of a possible pivot point because the president-elect hasn't yet said how he plans to end this war, but he has stated that he does plan to end this war. So I want to ask you something else. There's such a rich opportunity to sort of sway public opinion or influence people right now in particular. Russia is also extremely good at information operations. There have been stories leaked, I say, in like not necessarily credible media sources, but proposing three-way splits of Ukraine as a way to settle this war. I mean, how effective do you think, how important are Russian disinformation operations during this critical time period in particular? And how are you seeing that play into the overall war?
Well, you're right, first of all, to cite that one of Russia's long-standing historical strengths has been operating in the gray zone, or as NATO refers to it, in the use of hybrid tactics. And hybrid meaning sort of subconventional, that is, in the realm of disinformation, misinformation campaigns, energy intimidation, non-attributable attacks like cyber attacks, or difficult to attribute attacks like cyber attacks and so forth. And we've seen this play out beyond the Ukrainian theater itself, onto the territory of NATO allies. And look, we should appreciate it's been happening here in the United States as well. We've had Russian-sponsored cyber attacks in the United States. We've had Russian-sponsored attempts to interfere with our election campaigns by way of disinformation, misinformation, and so forth. And of course, just this week, we've seen a report, an early report, a breaking report of a Russian, potentially a Russian attempt to disrupt under Baltic Sea transportation or communications cables, right? So these are all these are all very much in the Russian playbook. And you might ask, well, why? Well, when Russia views itself as a disadvantage in the conventional realm, especially now over the last several years, where the Russian army has largely suffered a heavy attrition in the war in Ukraine, it will revert not to conventional means, but to subconventional means because they're available. They're difficult to attribute, and Russia's actually quite good at these, right? So it's sort of a natural, it's a natural option for Russia to revert to these subconventional tools. And of course, in NATO language, these are referred to as sub-Article 5 tactics, right? Because Article 5 of the NATO treaty pledges all ally support to any ally which is attacked in the event of an armed attack.
Right. When you can
And
attribute
these are
it.
designed to subvert that definition and to offer options short of armed attack. Just a short historical vignette. On September 12th, 2001, so the day after 9/11, NATO actually debated, was the attacks on the U.S. on 9/11, did it constitute armed attack? And eventually they said yes. So within 12 hours or so, they got it straight. But there was this question of, well, wait a second, is a terrorist attack an armed attack? And how do we catalog that? And of course, it's not the way the treaty was written, right? The treaty imagined tank armies, flowing across the North German plain in an attack on Europe. But I think these subconventional or hybrid attacks, the heart of your question, really are the wave of the future, especially as Russia is constrained in the conventional arena.
You probably already know that the Cipher Brief works with deeply experienced experts on global and national security to help put context around today's headlines. But did you also know that the Cipher Brief produces a daily report that keeps you up to speed on national and global security stories that are impacting businesses around the world? Like the President's Daily Brief, the Cipher Brief's open source report should be your first read of the day to stay ahead of the national and global security stories impacting your world. Become a subscriber and get the report for free. Subscribe at thecipherbrief.com.
One thing that can be easy to forget amid the near constant headlines of attacks against Ukrainian cities is the suffering of the Ukrainian people. Since the launch of the Russian invasion more than 2.5 years ago, civilian infrastructure, gas, heat, telecommunications have all been routinely targeted by Russia. Cipher Brief Chief International Correspondent Meurmishvili sits down this week with Archbishop Borys Gudziak of the Ukrainian Catholic Church to talk about the living conditions for Ukrainians, collaborators inside of churches, and ongoing efforts to return tens of thousands of kidnapped Ukrainian children.
Archbishop Gudziak, thank you very much for finding the time to talk to us today. Let's start from the overall situation in Ukraine. Now, Russia is continuing to attack Ukraine's civilian infrastructure, which is causing all kinds of issues for the Ukrainian cities and population. So how do you assess the overall situation?
Well, the overall situation is very difficult. People that have not experienced a bombing or an attack of drones or missiles can hardly imagine it. People in Ukraine have been living with it for 3 years during the full-time invasion, and in some cases for 10 years since Russia began the war. Last Sunday was the biggest missile drone barrage at the capital of the city. Every day, different cities are being hit and people are killed. Civilians. There's over 4,000 schools damaged or destroyed, 2,000 hospitals, 15,000 miles of roads, countless bridges, 700 churches, hundreds of museums and other cultural objects, and the housing of millions of people. And of course, more than 14 million people were forced from their homes. Some of them have come back, but not many. At least 6 million are abroad, and there's at least 4 million internally displaced persons, so that it is difficult. This is from one point of view unbearable, but people have been bearing it in Ukraine because the alternative of resistance is worse. It's genocide, or the obliteration, for example, of our church, which every time there is a Russian occupation in the last 300 years, our church is rendered illegal. It has to go into the underground, the catacombs. So people are tired. This winter is quite threatening because up to half of the energy grid infrastructure has been damaged or destroyed. And the winter is rough in Ukraine, but people resist because they have no choice.
Let's talk about the role of the church, and whether you want to talk about your church or church in general in Ukraine. What role is the church playing in helping the population to maintain the spirituality and hope and resilience?
I think almost all churches in Ukraine are a source of dignity. They inspire people to realize that they have a God-given dignity, and they create community. And when we feel the solidarity of others in the nation and internationally, there is a strong strengthening of the spirit. The Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, which has a very clearly articulated set of social teachings, which is based on Catholic social doctrine, has been forming society, not only its own members, but I would say that President Zelensky unconsciously or subconsciously is a student in the School of Catholic Social Teaching. The church has been emphasizing God-given human dignity, solidarity, subsidiarity. In other words, giving people at the lower level the authority and the responsibility to act and to defend themselves. And of course, that all of this is supposed to work for the common good. Our church and others are involved in humanitarian activity, sharing food, shelter, clothing with those who have been deprived of their homes and of their welfare. Also, the churches have chaplaincies. It must be noted that there is some equivocal qualities in the position of the Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. On the one hand, many of its members are on the front, and it has taken an official stance against the war. On the other hand, it, for all the decades of the time of independence until now, has maintained a tie with Moscow, and often has been the platform for Russian-oriented rhetoric and policy orientation. So there is a controversial quality to this church, which also has had a disproportionate number of collaborators with the Russian authorities.
Let me ask you about that. How pervasive is that? And is there some sort of pushback from the Ukrainian society or other churches to expose what, in some cases, what Russia may be doing in Ukraine through its church?
Well, the greatest pushback is that Ukrainian citizens who were members of this church have tended to move away. There is no clear sociology. We don't have statistics, but there are ever fewer people who associate themselves with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. There is movement in this church. Some members, although apparently not really hierarchs, bishops, are saying we have to make a complete, definitive break with Moscow. So this church finds itself in a self-created difficult position, and it is a dynamic one. There's change, there's movement of people, and we will see where this will lead to.
Earlier, when we started the interview, you mentioned how unbearable the situation is for most of the Ukrainians in the country. Also, very unbearable, unimaginable is the reports that Russia has taken tens of thousands of children, Ukrainian children, to Russia. Now, does the church play any role in bringing those children back, or what's the impact of this just unimaginable situation on Ukrainian society?
Percentage-wise, very few of these children have returned. Different churches try to work on this very painful topic in different ways. The Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, through the Holy See, through the Pope and the Vatican, have on numerous occasions presented lists of people who have been abducted by the Russians or prisoners of war, Ukrainian prisoners of war. It has not been a highly successful process. Some POWs have been returned, but tens and tens of thousands of children have not.
Is there any sort of bridge or communication, maybe through church to church relationship, to keep tabs on those children? Do we know where they live or what conditions they are in?
Well, the Moscow Patriarchate in Russia is utterly in cahoots with the government regarding this war. So it is not a reliable partner in terms of the liberation of children, POWs, or in any other human rights question. In fact, it calls this war a holy war, justifying the war crimes and the crimes against humanity. Not a single bishop in Russia of the Russian Orthodox Church has spoken out against this war. And those clergy, priests, deacons who have done so or have simply refused to publicly pray for Russia's victory in this war, not even speaking out against it, but just refusing to pray for Russian victories, have generally been marginalized, defrocked, and some have been imprisoned, tried and convicted of crimes against the Russian war effort. So the channel of through the dominant Moscow Patriarchate Church is unreliable. Other churches, unfortunately, have been suppressed in their reaction. There are very few religious bodies, and there are very few Russians in general who today, in any public forum, take a stand against this war. So it is not a very hopeful situation.
That's it for this episode of The World Deciphered, brought to you by the Cipher Brief. If you're looking for solid reporting and expert analysis of national and global security issues during the week, I invite you to visit thecipherbrief.com. If you're looking for insider gossip on who will be taking on what roles under the next Trump presidency, I invite you to check out The Dead Drop, a Cipher Brief exclusive for subscribers that brings you the very best gossip from the national security world. I also encourage you to stay up to speed on what's happening in the world with the Cipher Brief's daily open source report. That as well is a subscriber exclusive you'll only find at the Cipher Brief. I'm Suzanne Kelly. Thanks for watching. We'll see you here next time on The World Deciphered.